right, we're live. Hey, all, how you doing?
Good.
Great.
Doing good. Thanks.
Why don't you guys just introduce yourself down the line, and we'll just get started.
All right, I'm Clint Kitson. I'm the technical director for Code, which is the open source initiative at Dell.
I'm Tim Hawken. I'm a software engineer and tech lead at Google.
I'm Brendan Burns. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft.
Great. Hey, I've noticed something really interesting in the past few weeks, really, and I think it was, I think it's mostly the doing of people like yourself, and I think people are starting to realize that Kubernetes is a commodity, and that seems to me like a bit of a breakthrough. Is it to you or not?
I think it's a breakthrough. I think it's a natural evolution. It's great to see. I think it's what we kind of always wanted, because I think at this point we can make it boring. I think for a long time we've been saying, let's go make this thing boring, and I think now that it's a commodity, that's kind of inherently that way.
I think commodity is sort of a weird word. A commodity sort of implies that it's replaceable with something that's functionally equivalent, and I'm not sure that's the right
What's the right word?
Ubiquitous,
Yeah.
assumable, is, I think, maybe perhaps more
Universal.
more palatable. Early on in this process, I spoke with someone who I respect a lot, and they gave me the guidance that you'll know you succeed when people can just assume that they have you. Right? They can assume that Kubernetes is there, and that's success. I think that's finally where we're getting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you have new technology emerge, and there's a lot of sometimes chaos in the industry, a lot of different people doing different things, and when you come back and the community starts agreeing upon how things should work and agreeing upon different technologies, I think it's a great thing, and I think that falls in line with kind of assumed. You've got early on chaos, and Kubernetes is one of those assumed platforms that's going to be great for infrastructure.
So what does it mean then for its evolution, for its development?
Well, I think the most interesting thing, and the thing that I'm most excited about, is if you do assume that it's everywhere, if it is ubiquitous, suddenly you can build on top of it, knowing that you're not restricting people by building on top of it, right? So all of these tools can view the Kubernetes APIs as a layer that they can target no matter where people want to run their code.
I think the biggest thing that pops to mind on this is the amount of trust that have been put in the project. People literally running their businesses on it, and we have to continue to take a really strong stance on compatibility, on testing, on making sure that we don't ever break users. We don't get sloppy with API changes, those sorts of things. The bar was always high, it's just getting higher.
Yeah, user experience is going to be critical, and I think in the cloud native space we tend to think of just empowering applications, right? We want to enable dynamic management of applications, we want to enable them to be better, and having a consistent base that they can rely on really gets us to that point.
Right. So those are challenges then. So what are those challenges that really need your attention and need the attention of the community to make sure that people still assume that not only will Kubernetes be there, but it'll be reliable and it'll be useful and it'll be something that makes sense to really be part of what they do?
I think the growth of the project has to necessarily slow down. I think we have to focus on portability, as paramount over everything. The abstractions that we provide historically are really focusing on applications and things that application users would want to use and consume and understand. And I think that it's really important to hold that line, especially as we enter this era where it becomes about the business and the money, and we're going to see a lot more interest from competing parties who are trying to push into infrastructure concepts or trying to push into places that I don't think Kubernetes belongs. And so we have to hold the line on that.
I think another really interesting thing is I feel pretty strongly that Kubernetes so far has been built to empower people who kind of already knew how to build distributed systems, and it makes their lives easier, but it doesn't really, I don't think it broadens the tent very much. I don't think it makes people who might not otherwise have been able to deploy reliable systems capable of doing that. I think we need to build on top the right tools and the right frameworks that enable people who might not otherwise have come in and built distributed systems to be empowered to do that, right? So I think that's about also broadening the set of people who would consider this something that they would want to use.
So you mentioned one talk. One of the issues is like compatibility, right? There's lots of people building out different flavors of Kubernetes, so to speak, right? Different management platforms and such. Is that part of what you're talking about when you need to slow things down in terms of those, so there can be some uniformity, so there can be a foundation there?
I think somewhat. There's always a risk of fragmentation, especially when companies and businesses with opinions and a stake in how people do things enter the space. There's also just the sense of the API surface area can't be infinite, right? We can't be everything for everybody. We have to draw a bounds around what Kubernetes is and say this far and no further. And if you want to go further than that, here are extension mechanisms. The project itself can't control and contain every facet of every problem that every user is going to need.
And I think that's really interesting when you look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and the different tools that are kind of built around how to really operationalize and how to run these environments. You got to architecturally keep Kubernetes focused. I think boring is the right concept. You keep it focused on what it really needs to do at an infrastructure level in terms of abstracting APIs and things like that. And then the surrounding tooling, working through those APIs, is how you're going to build a more sustainable environment for customers to be able to use.
So, but there's still aspects of Kubernetes that we're still starting to see that need a lot of development, where there's still a lot of work to do. I think, for instance, around storage, right? And CSI is emerging, and it's going to be part of 1.9, as I understand. What are storage is one area of development. What are some of the others? Perhaps we could talk about storage first.
Yeah, I think storage is really interesting. When you look at how to architecturally build the right platform, one of the new things in Kubernetes 1.9 that you guys are talking about is the introduction of CSI. And previously a lot of storage drivers were internal to Kubernetes. CSI enables us to bring the storage drivers outside, and I think that's an example of essentially commoditization of certain really important functionality that fits well into the Kubernetes platforms that really enables applications. And I think that spans across many domains, but architecturally it's really the right approach to building that boring infrastructure level.
I was going to say, I think that there's a lot that we're going to see in sort of more of the enterprise-y space. I think we're already seeing suggestions about how we might introduce things like policy around what kind of resources you can create, what's the shape of certain resources that you're going to create, things that are happening in identity. We really need to drive container identity into the system. It's not there right now. I think that the slowdown that needs to happen, I think, is in the surface area. It's like we've sketched the map and we need to go back in and fill in all the right details in all the right places. We need to stop expanding. We need to stop the universe from expanding and focus a little bit on colonizing the worlds that we've already built at some level.
I have to agree. I think the security, the identity pieces of the system are really sort of soft spots still, and their place is getting a ton of energy right now. I don't want to be adding a ton more new concepts to the system, to the core of the system, right? We're building these extensibility mechanisms so that we can try new things and work outside the bounds of the core system, and let the ecosystem sort of thrive and figure out what's going to stick.
What are some of those areas you need to fill in? You're talking about that, instead of expanding the universe, important that we have an urban growth boundary, and so the densities within the boundary. What is that density that you need to, or what is it that you need to fit there that needs filling out?
Well, I think the biggest one, as I said, is identity. We really don't have. We have external RBAC, but we really don't have any notion of identity in the system. Everything.
What issues is that?
Well, I mean, so that means just things like, if a container is running, who is the person or what is the identity that container runs as, right? You can't, if you want to use RBAC even to talk to the API server, but let's say you want to talk to other services, you need a way of presenting who you are. And inside the system right now, there is no way of doing that. All the solutions that exist are ad hoc, are user-defined, aren't tied back to the original authorization of the user who created the thing. So you need a much richer notion of the identity of the code that's running inside of a container to light up a whole bunch of scenarios around, to use the existing authorization technology actually that's already built into the API server.
And playing off just authorization and policy in general, I think we're seeing with the uptake of things like Istio, the sort of proliferation of the desire to apply policy to everything, right? Policy, all the things. And I think it's great. I mean, policy is a concept that end users can think about in terms of abstractions. And so I think we're going to see more pressing in that direction, and not just like how to define policies, but how do you synchronize policies across clusters, across environments? Where do policies originate from? Those sorts of things I think are really required things for, especially for enterprise users who have strong structure and governance to their compute models, and we need to be able to work within that.
I think the breakdown of who's operating the Kubernetes platform and who's consuming from it, I think RBAC is a really important aspect to that. And as we've done a lot of stuff in the past, and
why?
Because it allows you to have different teams in your organization work together on a platform. You've got your operations teams who manage the platform for you, and then you've got your consumer team, like who's building applications and running them. And if you don't have this proper level of RBAC or multi-tenancy, then you really just have the dev team who's trying to operate it themselves. Right? They have a hard time working in the right way with the operations teams.
As a good example of this, if you're running right now, if you're running an application that needs access to a secret or a certificate, there is no way to say, hey, this application can access that secret, but the developer deploying the application can't. That's a critical capability, right? Because it means that the people who manage the certificates don't have to be the developers. It's that my front end should have access to my front end SSL cert. My developer shouldn't. My developer should have privileges to deploy my front end, which then has privileges to access the certificate. We really can't express any of that stuff right now inside of the system, and it's really critical for allowing the right kinds of access to the different pieces of the system.
It's separation of concerns, right? You have separation of concerns.
Right.
You have different users who have different hats, and you need to be able to clearly wear one hat or the other. Many people are going to wear more than one hat, but they need to be different hats.
I think and we started this out to talk about enterprises, right? And from an enterprise perspective, the teams that they have tend to be different. You've got a storage team, right? You've got a team running just core infrastructure, servers, and you've got teams running Kubernetes at this point. And they're different groups that want to make sure that they have their own control. So it's just really important to bring this into the enterprises.
But I would say also for an automation perspective, which is I want one team to rotate all my certificates. I don't want each dev team to be responsible for rotating their own certificates, but I don't want that certificate rotation team to be able to push code to my front end, right? I want that separation of concerns that enables me to have people focus on a specific thing and do that job really well.
It seems like there's boundaries, right? And there's overlap in the boundaries, and it's understanding the constraints that you need to create for yourself in order for what you're talking about, to be real. I'm curious on what is the approach that you're taking, to address these issues.
Well, the very first thing is really that a container has to have as we said before, it has to have an identity. Right now, and a container doesn't have an identity right now, and it has to be an identity that's different than the user that created it. And there's just none of that infrastructure.
What's the approach then to provide that identity?
I think we're figuring it out. I think there's stuff like the work that they've done, Joe and others have done with Spiffy is one approach, but Spiffy is done from the outside in. I think we're going to have to build it more deeply into Kubernetes itself in order to make it work. But I think this is a case where we're going to build prototypes and take a look at examples and then figure out how you integrate it into, I guess sort of like CSI at some level. Like we're going to build a bunch of examples and then we'll say, there's a generic pattern that we can use here, and we'll go apply that. And
we've reached this point in our life cycle where big customers are taking Kubernetes seriously, and we are finally being able to engage with their security people and their identity teams and being able to really get to the crux of their requirements, which we weren't able to do 2 years ago.
in terms of this identity, as you were describing it, I listened to Joe the other day, and he was talking. Actually, it was yesterday in one of the sessions, and he was talking about, hey, we've got controllers today that sit outside of the containers, and they tend to manage the lifecycle and help an application scale. And he mentioned that the applications themselves may use the downward API. Like the applications themselves may start to interact with Kubernetes to do that. And so I thought that was really interesting because it's the first time that I'd heard identity used, which is very similar to what I think you're saying here too,
yeah.
right? It's a pattern that could be used. Yeah.
How about service mesh technologies and their role? And we're just seeing the emergence of server mesh. I mean, we did a pancake breakfast this morning with Boyne, and we talked about service mesh and the kind of in terms of the context of what they're doing over there, what William's doing. Istio is another project entirely. What's the role there? What's the evolution of service mesh within Kubernetes?
I think service mesh is playing on concepts that we sort of already have, but using them in a different way. I think Istio is a great example of doing something sort of outside of the core of Kubernetes, and it's bigger than Kubernetes, right? Istio can work with VMs and work with physical hardware. It's networking, but it works. It exists outside the core of Kubernetes. They're figuring out what the right abstractions are, and then we can bring that in. And the sort of mental model I have is we can dig a hole that is just the right shape for something like Istio to fit into. And I think we have need of those abstractions. In fact, we've discussed it many times in our community, in our SIGs. And Istio is doing a great job of actually shaping what that thing will look like, I think.
Yeah, I think that, not to keep harping on the same topic, but I think that Istio without identity is actually not as useful as it could be. And so I think it shows that in order to really light up these scenarios, we need an integration between the orchestration technology and these sort of services that live outside. I think it's great that Istio lives outside. I think it's the right architecture, but it's going to need services in Kubernetes to truly be lit up.
It's interesting to me, like a container having an identity. It seems unusual.
No, it's actually pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's like, I'm going to go make a TCP connection. Who am I?
Right.
You need to know, right? And it's clearly not the developer.
But if it's ephemeral... Right.
No, but it still needs to have an identity, right? Like for access control, for rate limiting, for...
So the identity goes away, it can come and go?
Well, I think that actually the identity is usually going to be tied more to something like a deployment. Like we say that the container has an identity, but really a bunch of containers are likely to share the same identity, and that identity is a more permanent thing, like front end or middleware or whatever it happens to be.
The identity has a life cycle independent from any one container, but the container is uniquely associated with an identity, right? Or the pod, or whatever the right constructs are, the deployments, the daemon sets. They are acting on behalf of and as some entity. And today, early Kubernetes, we sort of didn't pay attention to that, knowing that we would have to come around and cross that bridge, and here we are. Great
conversation to have further on. I want to hear what you're thinking about how we fill in this world as from a storage perspective.
I think that from the top side, we're looking at all types of applications that should be able to work with Kubernetes, and there's definitely some work to be done to make that interoperability, like between the application and Kubernetes, a little bit better. We talked about controllers being the one way that people are making more advanced applications that can really leverage the Kubernetes features. This downward API, or the ability for the application itself to kind of reach up into Kubernetes and make requests, is really interesting. But I think really focusing on having an easily consumable infrastructure level that Kubernetes provides, and having the libraries that allow people to develop the applications and their controllers is really an area that can use some focus, and that's going to enable the next level of applications to enter Kubernetes, and I think that's essentially where the next area should be.
Thank you for a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate all your hard work you've done in the community, and thanks for coming by, and look forward to keeping in touch and having another conversation soon.
Absolutely.
Our pleasure, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Talk to you later.